much. I was asked if I wanted a mic. I said, no, I have a teacher voice. So just let me know if you can't hear me, but I know to project from the diaphragm and look up, so let me know if I start doing this to you. Also, I just want to preface this with an apology. I'm laughing because my talk today is about how gestures may possibly be a form of representational and visual knowledge, but I'm somewhat hindered. I had an accident the Sunday before Christmas and I broke my wrist. So it's actually much better and I'm kind of mobile, but there's just some things I can't do, like put things into sockets and pull them out. So thank you so much for your bearing with me, and I'll try not to wave my cast at you too much. So my talk today is transcending time, space and time, using visualizations to explain chemical processes from the molecular to the macroscopic. So since this was a STEM engagement seminar, I thought for the sake of the students that I would try to convey to you the importance of STEM teachers in my life, and to see how you can have really rewarding STEM careers from a variety of pathways. And mine's a very eclectic one and kind of untraditional, I think. And so I thought I'd just share it with you, and then you might get a little bit of an idea of who I am as a person and how the things that I study fascinate me and possibly why. So I think that the first important influence in my life regarding STEM was in the 6th grade. I had some teachers who were very caring, and they noticed that I had a propensity for math, and I was a very shy, quiet kid who never said anything. I used to love to read. I would just do that more than anything, and I used to read, and so I was extremely quiet. Didn't like reading out loud because I could, read it better myself, kind of thing. But I didn't know that I was good in math. It just came to me. I was just fine. But they gave us all an assessment, and they took 4 of us, 2 girls and 2 boys, and had us take math with the older kids. So it was very intimidating to me because I was with all these older kids that I didn't know, and I was with these 2 boys who were really bright that didn't talk to me, and 1 girl that I didn't know either. So it was just a very interesting challenge, yet I still think of that as the fact that I know my decimal fraction percent equivalents like this, and how to do with fractions, and I'm not afraid to work without a calculator all the way back from that particular influence. And I had a fantastic math teacher, Mr. Bird, who I still remember to this day because he highly influenced me to say, oh, you can do this. It's neat. So in high school, I was very fortunate. I had very good science teachers. I went to an all-girls Catholic high school, but despite the fact that they were limited and small in size, my chemistry teacher, who was chemistry and biology, engaged me in my very first research project, which you've got to laugh because I purposely have not taken biology since high school. Don't want to touch stuff. In fact, he sat us in reverse order of our performance on exams in class. I, of course, dutifully sat near the front because I wanted to hear every word. And then after the first exam, I got put in the back with the rats and the mice and stuff, and I was not happy. And instead of learning, I kept getting good scores and kept getting relegated to the back of the room with the animals. But I did do a project with Grunion. We went out dutifully one night. He got the Grunion, he had the license to do so, spawned Grunion, got eggs. So I wouldn't have done that, that wouldn't have been my thing. But what I stayed after and came after school many times was, we were trying to do what Dr. Dixon often does, which is look at how we could get Grunion to hatch in different conditions. We were using different pH conditions and basic conditions, and that was kind of neat. So that was the very first exposure that I had to research in a real scientific way, even though that wasn't necessarily my topic of choice, because right from high school I really liked chemistry, but I couldn't tell you why, I just did. Sorry. So from there I went to the University of Southern California. Fortunately, I was on scholarship. I was a chemistry major, have a BS in chemistry from there, and as a senior, I engaged in undergraduate research. So I encourage all of you students, undergraduate research just changes your life. It gives you an appreciation of what science really is, how hard it is, how much you have to troubleshoot and solve problems, and you learn to become a good manager of time because you learn how you can multitask and do things like, okay, I'll set this up, and then I'll go to class, and then I'll come back. And it also teaches you really important things like every Friday clean up the lab and make sure it's ready to go. Okay. While I was there, I did research my whole senior year, and then Dr. Reed, as a new professor, had some grant money, so I was able to be paid to work for him during the summer. I took a summer class, and then I went into my 5th year to get a teaching credential. and I needed some more chemistry classes, and so research applied, so I did another year of research. And I think my proudest moment was the research that we did. He was a bioinorganic chemist. We did picket fence porphyrin chemistry. We were each assigned a different transition metal, and I was assigned manganese for no reason whatsoever, except I was it. And I was the only one who got to be able to load the manganese in the porphyrin and then check to see if it could reversibly oxidize. Because the big project overall is, could we possibly get something like a picket fence porphyrin to reversibly oxidize and maybe be the precursor to an artificial blood system? So my JAX publication, I was the least senior author on the whole thing, but that came from that particular picture, and I still have this picture from Bob Scheid at Notre Dame, which is the X-ray diffraction picture, and that's like my pride and joy. I still have that. So my first STEM career, I view myself as having three. So my first STEM career was that I taught high school science, primarily chemistry, physics, and some math. I was a science chair of a high school for 8 years, and that was really wonderful for me because I got to live out my vision of what I thought made good high school instruction in science. I had to order stuff for biology and physiology and all anatomy, even though I was not one who liked that kind of thing. Really worked with my faculty to think about having common final exams and setting our goals for what we wanted for our department to be. I was very fortunate because my principal, once he saw that I did fine, he gave me a lot of trust and had me have a lot of participation in the hiring of new faculty as they came along. So I was really pleased to have done that. I loved teaching. I was doing it for 15 years. The only reason I left was it's the scientist in me kept saying, why is it that what I do works and doesn't work? Why? There's something behind, there's something more than just my knowing what it is. So I was constantly going to college classes with my students because they would say, hey, I could go to this program if the teacher will go with me. So I take a math class with a student, I take a science class, I did this, that, and the other. I said, finally, I just want to go back to grad school myself, and I want to get a PhD in chemical education. So applied around the country and ended up at UCLA, which does not have a chem ed program, but because they offered me a fellowship, I just, we'll make one. So again, students, sometimes opportunities drop in your lap. It doesn't look like it's the right one or the perfect fit. But if you have people who will support you, like my advisor who's a specialist in bilingual bicultural evidence, which is nothing at all in chem ed, but she supported me because I was very focused about, here's my plan, I would write it down to her, these are the classes I want to take, here's the influences I want to have to get this degree. And every assignment that I had, in every class I did, I turned it into a chemical education assignment somehow, some way. And so if you have that kind of drive and focus, and you can articulate what you want to do and you have a plan, you usually can get people to support you and to help you achieve what you want. During that whole time, I actually worked in the chemistry department for Dr. Orville Chapman, who is the Associate Dean for the College of Letters and Sciences, and for Dr. Arlene Russell, who was a mentor of mine from way back when I was still a teacher. So I worked there and felt part of the chemistry program, and that's where I first met Dr. Chadwick, because she was a postdoc there during the time I was there. So my PhD work had to do with organic chemistry. And as always, I used this particular topic because it was where I struggled in organic chemistry. I'm not a good visualizer. I don't have very good visual spatial skills. So all the literature that I had was I was that person. I was that particular example of what goes wrong. So I was worried about how is it that we can take these abstract signals in a two-dimensional space that you just see these peaks going up and down, and turn them into someone's mental image of a 3D molecule. What does it take? So essentially my dissertation was the influence of prior conceptions in molecular structure and patterns of problem-solving strategies on the process of learning to interpret nuclear magnetic resonance. So the interesting challenging for me, again, students, was I had two audiences on my PhD committee. I had my education professors and I had my chemistry professors, and I had to learn to speak to both of them, to be valid and authentic to both, and that was a pretty interesting tightrope to walk, but it was really good for me because I really had to be thinking through clearly and articulating clearly what I was trying to do. So really quickly, my study involved taking a program that Dr. Chapman had created, where it was really early touch screen, where you could touch a spectrum and you could enlarge it, and you could magnify the peaks so you could see triplets and splitting. He also had PetCore and COSY and some other things that you don't ordinarily teach organic chemists in there, at least sophomore organic chemistry students. And I put them in groups of 3 with different combinations of gender to see how they solved the problem and how they arrived at the final structure. My 2 structures, one of which was this one here, one was planar, and the other one was a cyclohexane, so it was non-planar. So could they get the correct nuances of the structure, which is the kind of thing that I would miss, even if I followed all the rules for doing it, because I would always forget, like, I didn't bother to visualize it in my head and what it was really looking like. And part of it was because of the way we represent our chemistry. It always ends up being 2-dimensional on a piece of paper or a board. And now we have the magic of computers who can sometimes draw that out for us and let us build a 3-dimensional or a pseudo 3-dimensional model. So what I did find, much to the chagrin of the organic professors at UCLA, is that the students who are in the second quarter of organic chemistry actually don't know the difference between planar and non-planar molecules. They don't know the difference between alkanes and alkenes and alkynes and aromatics. They couldn't explain them in any way, shape, or form. They basically were algorithmically using the rules to get a structure, and so therefore they were arriving at pretty much haphazardly. They weren't really thinking through. So I would ask them oftentimes, do you see the molecule in 3 dimensions? Because I did an exit interview, and basically everyone said no, because this is what our professor shows us, so this is what we do, and this is what the book says, so this is what we do. So here's the introduction to my really strong belief that the way we can help novice people learn chemistry is to explain what our representations are, how they're good, where they're weak, and what they can do for us. And, very importantly, explicitly instruct them when structures have 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional aspects, because they all look 2D or they all look flat pretty much all the time. So finally, I'll bring you to my 3rd career, and then it will drive us into the main topic of my talk today, which is I am now a chemical education researcher as a professor at Cal State Fullerton, which is your neighbor down the road. I've gone up through the ranks from assistant to associate professor, and I'm now a full professor, and that scares me because all of a sudden people are looking up to me. And I go like, what? I think I'm still a high school teacher back down in San Pedro. So I also taught for a while in the science education program. They had a Master of Arts teaching science, so I taught people how to do science education research and supervised over 30 students' master's theses up to this point in time. I have one ChemEd master's student who did a year-long project in analytic chemistry and actually atmospheric chemistry with Dr. Paula Hudson, and then did a study on development of mental models in her high school classes. So she has an MS chemistry with an emphasis in ChemEd. So I'm always looking for that if anyone's looking that. That's a good type of degree if you want to teach at a community college, because you'll have a traditional basic chemistry type of research experience plus a chemical education research experience. You'll have kind of combine both worlds. This is our main laboratory center here, if you've ever gone down. The shorter building is called Van Black Hall, and that's where we have most of our instructional labs and our research labs. And then the building behind is McCarthy Hall, the oldest building on campus with the oldest and most frightful elevator. And it is where the home of the College of Natural Science and Mathematics, and on the 5th floor is where you find most of our chem department. So, having given you a background, I want to tell you a little bit about what my agenda is in chemical education research, and then describe just one of my projects for you today. And hopefully I'll watch the time so I don't go over and be understanding and respectful of that. So overall, I look at visualization and conceptual understanding. How do people develop visualizations? How do they interpret them? How do they use them to understand very basic things in chemistry? And what I mean by conceptual understanding is the basic concepts that you need to make relationships. And from that sense, I'm a constructivist. I think of concepts being linked together to make what they call schema. And it's the schema that allow you to make relations across the board, many things. How do I look at those? Well, I look at that by the means of using technology tools. So I was involved, as was Janice, with Dr. Pat Wegner, the late Dr. Wegner, in his Mastering Chem, which was an online kind of homework quiz instructional system. And right behind it, unbeknownst to him, because he allowed me to have that much input, I said, you know, you could really use this for a research tool because we can gather all this information that we're getting from students online and look at patterns and trends. Then I proposed with my colleague, Dr. Corinne Montaigne, a system like that called the Science Education Assessment System. That one, we didn't ever get a chance to get it funded to try it, but we also looked at, in my case, computer-based devices like probes, et cetera, how they might help students learn chemistry. And then some of my really basic work is what I call chemical literacy. I look at very basic things like, how do people understand physical chemical change? I've done that since my first year at Cal State Fullerton, mostly because I taught a course for future elementary teachers. It was a chemistry physics kind of class. And then I started giving the same assessments to the majors and to the biochemists. And I hate to tell us, colleagues, physical chemical change is a very, very fundamental concept that people struggle with. You would think that our seniors in biochem would have it down, and they don't really. If you look at the trends and patterns, they're still not really sure because they're not able to discern the difference between macroscopic and particulate explanations and which one's which, and the fact that you really need both of them to really understand it. So it's interesting. So finally, I've done work with chemical formulas and development of models. And then I also have a branch, when I first started out, more so than now, where I did evaluation for other people who had projects from usually National Science Foundation, usually in basic chemistry research. And they needed someone to do an educational component or evaluate their project in terms of its outreach. And so I would always run my research underneath those projects to make it interesting for me. So today, I want to talk to you about how one of my projects deals with a very interesting form of visualization, one that I would never have imagined when I first started on this embarkment of a chemical education research. First of all, how do we learn chemistry and why does it challenge us? And this is some of the literature, and one of the things I try to do when I give a talk is to make it very clear that my research, just like basic chemistry research, comes from a theoretical background. There's a scholarly literature regarding chemical education, and you will look for it and try to learn from it and take the theory to make predictions for things that you want to do and study. So some of the challenges that have been developed or reported in the literature are the ability to visualize. And right here, we have what we call, in psychology, impoverished representations. So these are the kinds of things that you will find in the first page of a chemistry textbook. Words like benzene and cyclohexane. For those of us who've studied chemistry for a while, those don't seem so far-fetched. But those are representations, those squiggles that make letters, B-E-N, Z-E-N-E, and we're ascribing a meaning to them, benzene. But if you're what I'll call a real chemist, an expert chemist, you say the word benzene and it's not without connotations to you. You immediately think of the molecule in your head. Chemists talk about their molecules as if they're persons. They're real to them. They see them, okay? They see them. And so when the word benzene comes, there's this expert to go, I see it and all the possibilities and aromaticity, et cetera. And a poor novice student goes, benzene, what's that? You know, why is that special? So even if we use the chemical formulas, it does give us information, C2H6, C6H12, but it still doesn't tell us an awful lot. It tells us which elements are there, but not which ones and how they're bonded together. Because if you look at it, well, I have 6 carbons in a row and 6 hydrogens. If you ever ask someone who's not familiar with chemistry, give them the chemical formula, tell them how they're connected together. They'll give you some very interesting things, okay? We also have our line structures. And you can see here I have a calculus structure, and then I have the circle indicating the alternating double bonds in the benzene ring, and then our cyclohexane. When you look at cyclohexane, it looks flat, doesn't it? It looks flat. But someone who is an expert chemist looks at that, and it's not flat to them. But we have to teach our novices how to unpack that information and infer it from the symbols that we use. So it's an important idea. Another thing that makes chemistry hard is logical reasoning, quantitative skills, abstractions, and then finally the idea of conceptual change. People don't come to us blank They make meaning all on their own. And sometimes that meaning interferes with a more productive concept that we're trying to teach them from a chemical point of view. And it's our job to kind of make them see through maybe what we call discrepant events, why it might be a good idea to change their idea of how it works. But the big problem with conceptual change, I love my students who get so excited. I am going to do this intervention and I'm going to make sure that they don't have these misconceptions. And I said, you know, that's going to be really nice, but you have to stop and think about it. This is a belief system. Your knowledge is a belief system. You don't just change it overnight. It's not just one little 3-week exposure or one lesson that will make you change your mind for sure. So we have to really think of this as an ongoing, over time kind of thing when we work with conceptual change. So in other words, our science teachers in the elementary schools and the high schools and the community colleges and universities, we all got to work together, working on that, thinking about how we can guide people along and help them, because we don't always know exactly when they're ready for that change. That's the important part. So the visualization part is actually more complicated than you might believe. From cognitive psychology, there's 4 different aspects of visualization that are reported and could be measured. One is visual spatial ability. This is the one that you see most often, what they call mental rotations test. Firemen are given these kinds of exams. There's a chemical version that Carl Wamstead developed. And essentially they give you these abstract figures and they say, here it is and here it is. And you have to figure out how many rotations or what transformation made it change from this direction to that direction. And so in your head, you have to have an idea of how to mentally manipulate something that's in 2 dimensions into 3-dimensional space. But spatial visualization is yet another aspect of visualization, and that's your ability to retain and recall the parts of something that makes a structure. And then final, spatial orientation, the idea that you can remain unconfused if I change the orientation of an object. You still have an idea of like up, down, north, south, front, back, that kind of thing. Finally, and here's the part that's most important, the first 3 have been reported in the psychology, cognitive psychology literature for many years, and there are assessments or tools or instruments that you can use to measure people's ability to do these things. But imagery, that's what I am interested in, because imagery is your ability to call up a visualization or call up a mental model or build it. And that's not something that we have assessment instruments for. So this is my holy grail. How do I get something that will work to allow me to see the process by which someone does it, or how I can possibly help them to make those kinds of leaps? So the other thing that chemistry requires is formal reasoning, proportional, combinatorial, probabilistic. There are a lot of assessments that test in logical reasoning, and you can kind of look to see whether people, including yourself, are what we call formal thinkers or concrete thinkers or transitional thinkers. There's a lot of transitional thinkers in college. I assess my students very often through research where I have IRB and I check that, and I find often that they're more transitional as opposed to formal, which is fine. It just means I need to target my instruction knowing that that's true. We also find that if I look at the representations here, I have a ball and stick, which is a 3D model of the same molecule that I have a line structure for, and that this in and of itself, transferring or translating between one form of a representation and another through a lot of literature has been found to be very difficult for students to do. So often students will, teachers might say, well, if I just get them to write the formula and then draw the structure, they should be able to see the connection. But actually that's something that's not that simple and that has to be drawn out maybe in more steps to make that happen. So as we can see, chemistry is pretty much challenging, but it doesn't mean it's not without our ability to learn it. We just have to find the ways that we can do things to help support novice learners. So one of the aspects that I'm going to describe to you in terms of my visualization research is a new project that I started in terms of a Gordon Research Conference on visualization and science education that's held every 2 years. It used to be, it alternates between Europe and the US, although the last 2 times it's been in Rhode Island in the United States. What's neat about this conference is that about half of them are chemists, half the attendees are chemists. But the other half are people like me that are chemical education researchers, science educators, publishers, computer scientists, NASA, anyone who has to work with visualizing data from all areas. So we get all these wonderful talks about avant-garde things, haptics, and things that you can do to help people experience data in the real world, and how possibly we can assess whether it works or not, or how it works. In other words, how human beings interact with it. They have a program called a mini-grant program. So what they try to do is encourage people who attend the Gordon Conference, which is a week-long conference, to get together and to write a proposal that they will do some small research. It's a seed project, and they would like to see you have an international partner and people in different disciplines. So I engaged with an interdisciplinary team, Dr. Nancy Pelias, who's actually a physiologist, who's in the biological science department, and Dr. Trevor Anderson, who's a biochemist and a chemical education researcher as well. They're both at Purdue University. I knew Dr. Pelias because she worked at Cal State Fullerton for the first part of her career alongside me and worked in the MATS program until she moved to Purdue. We worked with Dr. Susan Golden Meadow, who's a psychologist and comparative developmental theorist from University of Chicago, who was there at the meeting. And then our international partner was Dr. Mark Van Mil, who teaches biomedical sciences, primarily chemical medicinal chemistry at the medical school in the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands. So here's the interesting thing. My projects have always been focused on the learner, what the learner does. I haven't worried so much about what the teacher does, not that it isn't important. I was just more fascinated and more interested in how learning occurs and what we can do on the part of the learner. So my research is very basic. I don't necessarily put interventions in, I sometimes do, but I really want to get what is the learner doing if I put these different stimuli in front of them. This project took me way out of my comfort zone because in this project, the unit of analysis is the instructor. We're looking at how can an instructor use visualizations to explain mechanistic processes that run from the molecular to the macroscopic. So if I talk about acid-base titration, I can refer to it, well, I'm just adding these drops of a liquid, and when I do so, I can kind of get to the equivalence point if I see this change in the color of the dye, a macroscopic process. But yet, I also want them to understand the chemistry, the particulate activity that's going on underneath that, and trying to make a map between those. The medicinal chemist and the human physiologist want to go from the cellular and macromolecular interactions that cause muscles to fire and to communicate with each other, and we have to talk about these processes. These processes tend to occur over time. So what we were looking at was, if we looked at how instructors explain things, did it have anything to do with invoking conceptual reasoning and modes of visualization? Did it have anything to do with what constitutes a good mechanistic explanation? And does it have anything to do with gestures being another form of representations that we don't normally think about in terms of instruction? So this is the CRM model that is the brainchild of one of my partners, Dr. Trevor Anderson, and his student, Sean Berg. He's thinking that when you talk about chemistry and a student learns that they have three kind of domains in terms of their understanding of it, and that is the conceptual domain, a reasoning domain, and then the mode of the visuals that they're going to use. The mode means, like, am I talking about a picture, a line structure, an image, that kind of thing. Those circles all interact, and we have our Venn diagram where we have the intersections, and you'll see that we can have areas where the conceptual and the mode overlap, and the reasoning and the mode overlap. This was one way of coding data that we were going to collect. I started to code that with some of my students, but found that it's pretty challenging to do. So this is something that we haven't abandoned, but we delayed, and we're going to work with Dr. Anderson and his grad students to redo or to look at the data we have collected from this point of view in the future. Because I'm very interested in the way that I coded it. What are the potential relationships between how we use the reasoning and conceptual understanding with visuals as we link them together. And what's interesting here also, he tended to give this assessment to students as well. So it's harder when we think of, okay, when I talk about a teacher explaining, is the teacher using or invoking conceptual understanding? Is the teacher talking about probabilistic thinking or invoking that kind of thing? So it's very interesting how you have to change your perspective to do it. The other way that we look at it, and this is the way that I started to code our data, is what constitutes a good molecular explanation. And Dr. Mark Van Wil has several publications on what he thinks are the factors that are necessary to make a good mechanistic explanation. Things like you have to talk about entities, molecular entities. So we'll talk about the fact that when I was doing molecular geometries, well, what are the entities that I want my students to know about? Well, atoms, molecules, bonds, lone pairs, unbonded pairs, covalent bonds. If you stop and think about it, there are certain aspects or features that they have to know or have a familiarity with in order for me to do that. We'll also find that when something's in a process, it will have states, beginning, middle, end. Maybe some other states, like in cell division, meiosis, you'll have the different phases or parts that you can characterize. Interactions, really important, that the entities possibly interact during the process of something happening. That sometimes there's a hierarchical organization of these entities, and sometimes there's some spatial arrangement of them, like in a biochemical molecule, that one piece has to come here and they have to be in a certain orientation before something magic happens. Events, things that happen over time, and space, and modality, the way they happen. These are some characteristics that make good mechanistic explanations. Now, we're not claiming that everyone has all of them, but it depends on what the explanation is, how many of them that are present. But these are things that tend to lead to that. And finally, while at that conference, Dr. Susan Golden Meadow presented a keynote talk about how gestures are a form of visualization and a form of learning knowledge that's basically unspoken. She says you can actually convey substantive knowledge through gestures. She's actually done studies with children in mathematics, and she noticed that teachers tended to do certain things to teach them, for example, balancing an equation. They'd write the equation on the board, and the teacher would go here and here with her gesture. And she found out that if she took the fifth graders and taught them the gesture here and here for balancing something, that they would actually use it and come up with better equations, or realizing that one side was not balanced with the other. So in other words, by teaching them the gesture, it actually caused that information or the concept to be instantiated more easily in the students. She's wondering, is this something that would also work with chemistry? Something she was interested in talking about, because she knew that it had a lot of visual and mechanistic aspects that gestures might be powerful in helping to learn. She also found that gestures sometimes align with the speech. In other words, they enhance the information, and sometimes they're conveying information that's not at all with what the person is saying, which is interesting. It also has a potential, gestures, to reduce cognitive loads. In other words, because it's telling you, reinforcing something, then you may not have as much difficulty attending to it. It doesn't seem to take as much effort to learn it. However, there are times when, if you're not familiar with gestures, that it might add to the cognitive load. So it's got, a double-edged sword. There are also signals to students. So if I do this to my class, they usually know I need to stop. Or I sometimes do, okay, and that means I'm going to make a transition from one idea to the next. And if you stop and think about it, teachers, or any time you've given a talk, you realize I do it. She was very adamant, because we thought, oh my goodness, well, only certain cultures do gestures, and maybe there's not a lot that we can share in science. But actually, she said, everybody in every culture gestures. We think that certain cultures don't gesture as much, but it's not true. It's just that they're maybe not as big, but they're there. So I laughed. I go, well, I know, given my background, that I probably gesture a lot, because I'm just, it's just something that I'm used to. But she said, no, you probably gesture just as much as anyone else, but you don't realize it. And I said, well, okay. So here's our hypothesis. Here's something that we want to try to establish with the research that I'm going to show you right now. And that is, we want to know, could gestures possibly be another form of visual representation? In other words, is it a way for us to help you visualize the chemistry in addition to the pictures and the 3D models and the computer graphics that we give you? And it happens naturally and spontaneously with an instructor. So you may be giving me all this information that helps if we can kind of find what good instructors do that lead to mechanistic explanations. If there's a repertoire of gestures, that's kind of what we're looking for right now. And if there's some best practices that we could recommend. We're like way early in this project, so I can't say that I've got that yet, but we have some interesting findings from what's done. Okay. I wanted to give you an idea of how gestures have something to do with a mechanistic explanation. So this is a very short clip of Dr. Nancy Pelias in Purdue. She's teaching a physiology class, and she's talking about myosin and muscle cells and how they communicate, how they fire, basically.
In smooth muscle, like myometrium, the structure is a little bit different. You have these globular head regions. So here's the myosin thick filament. Here's the myosin head, which would then activate hydrolysis of ATP if it binds to actin. And for some reason, in smooth muscle, we have these light chains that are around the neck region. And these are what turn this on and off in the case of smooth muscle. We don't understand exactly how it works, but we know that these light chains are essential in making this muscle work. So let's go back to striated muscle, and let me just remind you what I think you already know. If you look at striated muscle longitudinally, you can see thick bands and you can see thin bands. And so the thick bands are, the thin bands are where the actin is, the thick bands are where the myosin is, and the opaque parts are where actin and myosin are overlapping. So if we were to slice it right here, you can see both the thick, which is the myosin, and the thin, which is the actin, in a regular organized structure.
What hopefully you saw is she talked about the two light chains. Did you notice her hands? She's holding a presenter, but she's doing this with her hands. How many light chains are there? Okay. And then she's talking about, oh, we have the striated muscles. We have the thin and the thick. And she was doing that with her hand. You probably didn't even think about it because you were listening to what she said, but what she was saying was being augmented by the gestures that she was giving. And notice that those were in alignment with what her speech is. Bless you. So this is the research project, research questions for our group in our particular project that we did for our mini grant. We were looking at which key components of mechanistic explanations from the literature do instructors use, and what representations in terms of the disciplines of chemistry, biochemistry, and biology. That was our expertise background. How do the experts use a range of visualizations to illustrate key components? In what way do instructors' gestures reflect those key components? And what key principles can be distilled? Can we get maybe a series of best practice that combines visualizations with gestures? We're far from that at the moment because we've only been working on this about a year and a half. But we do have the following methods we're using: case studies. So this was not something that made me happy because, as I said, I tend to focus on the students and I can get interviews and their written work, but I'm the subject of analysis, I'm the instructor. We wanted to make sure we had people who were about the same level in terms of experience, so we ended up basically using ourselves because, of course, we don't have to pay ourselves to do it. And we could usually get a student who would videotape us. Otherwise, we have to pay someone, say, would you please do it? Okay, and we only had $6,000 in our grant, so we needed to be able to collect a lot of data, big bang for a little buck, right? So I taught a lesson on molecular geometry and acid-base neutralization to first semester general chemistry students. I basically thought molecular geometry would not be a mechanistic type of lesson, and we were doing it on purpose to see if it would, whereas acid-base neutralization was more mechanistic. Interesting what we found out, though, in terms of what happened. Purdue did biochemistry signaling, cascading signaling, and then you saw Dr. Pelias with her clip there, where she's looking at muscle functions, particularly striated smooth muscle function. We took the videos and they were transcribed word for word, but even more than that, the transcription took place in 3 parts. First, just getting the words. Then we broke them down into what we call topics or concepts. And then from that topic or concept, we tried to use that CRM coding to see if we could figure out what type of mode that the instructor was using. Then we took the speech and we analyzed it for those 9 entities of molecular explanations. And then finally, here's the hard part, this took a long time, we looked at the video without sound, paying attention to gestures that the instructor made. And so within the same time frame, within the same timing, we would make pictures of the gestures, describe them as objectively as we could, and then try to see if we could perceive from there what information that the gesture was trying to convey. Yes?
So, knowing what was going to be the subject matter, because you were planning the research and you're in part of it, did you find like you had a tendency to want to use more or less gestures, knowing that that was going to be part of it?
No, because you know what happened? Fortunately, I had one of my students that I always have with me who videotaped me when I was teaching. And once I started teaching, my students are my focus. I just kind of forgot that she was there. I mean, it's not like I wasn't unaware, but I was more concerned about doing what I wanted with them. Because I worried about that too. I'm going to be inhibited. But honestly, once I got in the room and it was like, this is what I needed, this is more important, this is my time, this is all I have to convey this information and to try to help them learn. I don't think it was very much different than what I normally do. I did make an effort in one of them to maybe do a video that I might not have done ordinarily, but that's not even part of what we really analyzed, so it didn't really matter. Okay, once we did all that, we selected the clips, and then we coded those, and the speech is coded directly separately from the gesture. So let me just give you just a quick snippet, and this is what I hate to see. This is me trying to teach the molecular geometry class. I teach in a studio classroom, so I have my students for 110 minutes because they have lecture and activity combined. So I do a concept, we stop and do some practice, and so I kind of incorporate activity time, demonstration time, recitation time within the lecture. So the sound here isn't as good as the one that Dr. Flies picked up. But what you're noticing that I thought I would have fewer gestures because look, I had models. I had bunches of representations. You can see on the computer screen that I had space filling models. I had Lewis structures. I had the ball and stick, and I had commercial molecular models as well. So I had loads, and this is the way I always teach that section. I have all those different types of representations for the students, hoping that one of them will be the type that appeals to them and might make them understand the concept that we're going through. So what's interesting is you notice that I am gesturing despite the fact that I'm holding on to the model, and sometimes I'm holding on the presenter. So it's amazing how much you gesture when you don't think about it. I didn't realize that I did it that much. Okay, so here's an example of a transcript. So we did it in Excel. You notice we have a time stamped, and then here we were trying to code for the reasoning. We tried to code for the mode, speech, and the gesture. And you can see we're cutting pictures so that we can kind of get the description of the gesture. And then here's the sample for just the gesture. Here I'm putting down, well, what are the visualizations that I was using, the styrofoam ball models, and then the Lewis structures, and the space filling, et cetera, and then what I was trying to do with my hands. So finally, here's what we're finding out. So for the molecular geometry, we had 3 clips during the course of the 50-minute lessons, and to try to get a representative sample, we tried to look, and I didn't code on purpose because I really had to take myself out of it, and we trained just to make sure that my students were reliable, but I had to be out of it so that I wouldn't, because I know what I wanted to do, but that doesn't mean what they're saying. So what's interesting is you notice that entities are the big thing throughout the lesson, the beginning, the middle, the end. Blue is the beginning, yellow is the middle, gray is the end. But things like hierarchical organization, when I'm talking about the molecular structure of a molecule, that came up more at the end or middle end of a lesson. That, so it gets higher, more frequent. And then the idea of change in events, it isn't as large because I'm talking about the structure of a molecule that you tend to think of as static, but it's really not, because I'm using kind of a VSEPR approach to say, here the bonds are going to be here, and there's going to be these interactions that cause them to get this geometry in space. And of course, we have the spatial organization, which comes up mostly at the beginning and the middle. But notice that the entities are big there, that I have to give people an idea of what they're talking about. And here's the gestures. Notice that the gestures weren't quite as frequent, but they were some similarities. We see that we have a lot of referring to gestures to entities, pointing to the parts of the molecule, states, what state they're in. And then here, the spatial organization. Notice that I have a lot more gestures of spatial organization at the end of the lesson. And then making sure that we're talking about whether they're connected to things in the world. That's what that one came up to. Okay, in terms of relationships, this is just the comparison of speech and gestures. Notice that there's a lot of alignment between the speech and gestures, but there's places where the gestures do more than the speech does. So I have more frequent gestures about entities overall, and in spatial organization I have a lot, which makes sense because if I'm trying to give someone an idea of space, using my hands gives you that a good idea than just the words that are telling you. Okay, and the representations, that tends to be talked about more with speech. And then coordination or communicative. Communicative are like stop, go, let's do this. That's almost always in speech and not so much in gesture. Okay, I also taught the acid-base neutralization lesson, and we see, sure enough, there's the entities again to establish the beginnings of it. And then I see that the states become important here, and then also seeing that I'm going to get into hierarchical organization and interactions. Notice that interactions, I didn't have much interaction specifically when I did the molecular geometry lesson. And here is the speech over the 3 clips. And for the speech over the 3 clips, again, I see the interactions increases and the temporal change increases with speech when I talk about titration. And then here's the comparison of gesture and speech over the 3 clips. Notice that here I see more of a difference, and I'm sorry that I put these colors here because they're white and can't really see, but I see there's differences between the speech and gestures more in the acid-base neutralization lesson than there was in the molecular geometry lesson, because I'm able to convey some information that I can't necessarily say with my words. And maybe, I'm not saying it's good or bad, that it maybe could have been different or enhanced. So what we find here, if I make a comparison, what we found, at least in these 2 lessons, is that the frequency of the modalities of a molecular explanation that are used depends on the content of the lesson. You're going to find that where I talked about acid-base titration, where interactions are important, and time, spatial, temporal time, I get more of those kinds of things in both speech and gesture than when I did the molecular geometry lesson. It wasn't that they were absent, and it turned out that there was a lot of mechanistic explanation characteristics in the molecular geometry lesson, but you can see them more powerfully in a lesson that has this space-time change. And the gestures are something that are augmenting the information that's being presented in the visualizations that are pictures and in the speech that the instructor is using. So here's the comparison of gestures again, and you see that it depends on what the lesson is, which ones you tend to get the gestures for. So here are my acid-base, time change, temporal, interactions. Where, I also have the entities. I usually have to talk more about what's an acid, what's a base, what's a hydrogen ion, what's hydroxide, and all the little entities you have to kind of talk about. They're there in terms of gestures that are pointed out. Now the gestures are usually because I'm pointing to things or I'm trying to represent them with my hands. So, future plans. We would like to take a look at this, and we want to now code it for the concept. Can I look at the gesture, and is it conveying a particular concept? That's, I think, more powerful to an instructor, because that's where we could find gestures that might be powerful and meaningful and allow you to enhance what it is when you're teaching. We'd like to code across the disciplines. We have clips from the other people, so we've kind of coded from different perspectives, and we want to try to share across that, and then look for particular patterns across the disciplines from there. So we hope that if we can get enough seed data, we might be able to go for a bigger project to do this beyond just the 4 of us and try to get novice instructors versus middle career instructors and experienced instructors. We've all taught quite a bit, so we may have our own ways of conveying things, maybe using gestures in ways that we don't realize that we do all the time, but maybe it's that novices do these as well, and that's important to find out. So, thank you, because I ran about 5 minutes over, but I do want to share with you an important quote. This is a book I read in grad school, and I can tell you grad school is a wonderful time, because all of a sudden you're spending time with ideas. And when I read this book, it's from the book Teaching as an Activity. It's actually a philosophy of science book. Thomas Green wrote it, and he was a physicist who became a philosopher about what science is and how you learn it. And this has really kind of been the driving force ever since I first read it. He said that the thirst for learning shall not be cultivated by a fearful and anxiety-ridden search for shortcuts. It shall begin to take form when we evidence patient and calm discovery of the wonders of this world and a corresponding capacity to marvel at them. And to me, that's what science is, marveling at the world. And I hope you have that opportunity to do it too. Thank you.
Dr. Gonzalez?
Mm-hmm.
It probably shouldn't be surprising that gestures are an important part of communication, since all of us gesture in one way, we say hello or we flip somebody off. I mean, so that's important. But it's interesting in that it suggests recordings, like lecture recordings, may miss something by not including the hands of people. There are often complaints about watching talking heads, but maybe we're missing an opportunity to teach by including hands, or at least a different angle of viewing. Do you think that will be robust, that the hand gestures really do help students learn?
Well, in terms of what Dr. Golden Medal and her group have done with math, that is the case, that you could actually help students learn things in math by teaching them gestures that are meaningful. But we don't know enough about it in all the other topics to be able to say there's this repertoire of basic things we can do. However, I think you're absolutely right, because it tells us that gestures, I'm getting the feeling that gestures are a form of visualization. They're another way of representing things that we want to with pictures. They're just pictures in time and space and with our hands. And therefore, when you are just listening to a lecture, you have to concentrate on the words. And as long as you're visualizing that well, it's going to be okay. But the gestures and the hands and the body language of the person adds information that is almost unspoken and creates that reduction of cognitive load that I think is a really good thing. So it's really nice, I think, if we're going to do like online things, that you might have videos of instructors who are actually talking and in front of a board or talking to students, so that that natural gesture comes through. I still think people do it anyway, even if they give a formal talk, they can't help but do it. But if that instructional setting includes that, we may not be, we're getting yet another stimulus to help people learn. I don't have the proof of it yet. We're well early in what this means.
So as a control, you could tie the instructor's hands behind their back.
Yes, and in fact, Dr. Golden Medal, she wanted us to go straight to the psychological experimental design, but our problem was like, I don't teach 2 classes where I can do this and then teach my normal way all the time. Plus, I said we were trying to get some other people in biology to video, and we have to get them to feel comfortable to do it. So, it's just not going to be, I just think we're too early. We just need to find out what I'll call the lexicon of gestures are in chemistry. We don't even know. And this is just me. And I don't know what Dr. Pelias has in terms of her lexicon for physiology and what Dr. Trevor Anderson has for biochem. I think there's probably some commonalities. We've seen that in some terms of clips we shared. But I think we need to get that so that we could go to the point, okay, let's try the experimental design. Because that's exactly where she wanted us to go. She wanted us to go, hey, you've got experienced teachers, teach 2 classes a different way with, gesture rich and gesture without. And I go, I don't know if I could control that. I think it would really inhibit. Yes, Jen.
I'm wondering what your opinion is, or if you think that there's any relationship between what we call learning styles and teaching styles and what you're talking about with gestures. Has there been any studies about whether people are considered visual, auditory, or kinesthetic, and what types of gestures they may use?
I am not aware of that. However, that's something I could probably try to consult with Dr. Susan Golden Medal or look in that arena for that. It wouldn't surprise me if there are some links. However, I know that most cognitive psychologists tend to think people put too much emphasis on the multiple intelligence model. And so what you should do is not go with what you do strong, but you should enhance what is not as good. So in other words, what an instructor should do is be aware that people may be kinesthetic or tactile or visual or audio learners, and they have a preference for that. You want to provide opportunities for all of those and develop those particular modes in which they're not strong, because that's a way that you can enhance your ability to learn overall. So I would not be surprised if there's a connection. It's not something we've done, but I'll have to look in the lit myself to see. It would be interesting. So a good idea though. Interesting. Any other questions?
Well, thank you very much. We'd like to invite everybody or just students? Everybody to, well, if we invite our dean, there's half the.
By the way,
There, to speak more with Dr. Gonzalez and have some pizza with us over in room 224-226. She has some flyers
I have some flyers
and
for
lots of
undergrads who
good
might want to know about our
advice.
programs. We have
and
3
lots of good
degree
advice
programs.
for people thinking about transferring into chemistry or even anything at Cal State Fullerton. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.